Had some that believed and some that were against, and that was kind of the departure of him when he left Athens. And so now we see after these things, Paul departs from Athens and he goes to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned with the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. All right, so Paul's not doing anything different. He comes to Corinth and he does what he always does. He goes to the synagogues. He begins to teach. He wants to teach not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And He's already kind of said to his own people that I'm kind of getting sick of you guys. I'm pretty much going to, move on. That didn't mean that Paul stopped preaching to Jews. When Paul said, forget you guys, I'm going to go talk to the Gentiles, because that didn't mean he then said, okay, I'll never preach to another Jew ever again. He was just saying the collective, as a group that was not converting over to Christianity, that was holding on to the Old Testament, that he wasn't going to sit there and, well, I guess, what's the term, maybe blow smoke, where you're blowing smoke, there's not really anything happening. So he says, hey, if you're not going to listen, we're going to go talk to them. But yet, he's still preaching to the Jews and whatnot. Now, Luke seems to be a very interesting writer. For one, you definitely can see, Luke was a physician, so you can definitely see that sometimes in the way he writes about, the human body and things like that. But we also see here in this scenario, it kind of gives a glimpse of everyday life, kind of how Paul got around. Now, see, he met with Aquila and Priscilla here, and the same job, so he goes in, he stays with them for a little bit, he's getting some work. So obviously he's making some money. He has to have money in order to live. But we also see that this is when Aquila and his wife Priscilla are first introduced. We see these individuals. They're mentioned again over in the book of 1 Corinthians. But there's also another thing here, and Luke is also putting kind of a time stamp on the events right now that are happening. We see here in this passage, he makes mention Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome. Now, we do have, and you could probably even get a more accurate date of idea of when this was, but we have a broad thing from 44 to 54 was when this guy reigned as the Pope. Not the Pope, the Emperor. The Emperor of Rome. And so we kind of are getting an idea of pictures of dates and some ideas of when things are happening. Now we move along here. Nothing's really happened yet other than telling us that every Sabbath he's going to the synagogues and he's persuading and trying to teach. Now, in verse 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your heads. I am clean from now on. I will go to the Gentiles. And this is where he really finally makes that distinction. And later on we see he's going to continue to seek out the Gentiles. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by vision. He says, do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. All right. There have been other times, probably the most time that we know of for sure with Paul is, his time in Antioch. He spends a lot of time in Antioch. It very much seems like maybe it is a home congregation to him. After his journeys, he He either goes to Jerusalem or he heads off to Antioch to tell them what has happened. But here in a vision, obviously God is seeing that there's some more work that needs to be done here. You know, sometimes Paul will run into problems, the people will start getting violent, and you'll just see Paul and he'll just say, okay, it's time to go. You know, and then they move on before anything happens. There's also times, we know, Paul gets thrown in jail. We just talked about the event with the Philippian jailer. There's also times that Paul gets beaten up, whipped, and all kinds of things that are done to him by the authorities even. We just read not too long ago one of the events where he was stoned, and it seems like pretty much they thought he was dead, and he gets himself back up and he goes back in. But now God is saying, hold on, there's some work to be done here. You know, nothing's going to happen to you. He says, don't be afraid, speak. He says, don't be silent, stand with what you believe, because God is with him. But he also gives them a little bit more comfort. He says, I have people here. Don't worry about it. You're not going to get hurt here. So we see a time period here which is unusual, at least I think mainly because he doesn't usually stay in places for very long. Maybe there's a couple of places where he's there for 3 months or he's there but a year and a half is quite a lengthy period of time. And you wonder, maybe that might be, I mean, obviously Paul wrote the letters to the Corinthian people because God inspired him to do that. But do you tend to write more? Well, we don't write letters anymore, right? But when you did, for those that remember writing letters, did you tend to write letters to people that you didn't have a relationship as much? And what I mean by that is you're seeing he's spending a lot of time here in Corinth, and obviously we get 2 letters from him for that. Now, do I think Paul's only writing to it because he knows that? No, he's writing those letters for the reasons he's inspired by God. But it's just that idea, and then the idea that there's possibly was another letter that was written to the church in Corinth. That, you know, he's got a concern. You spend 18 months with a group of people, you're going to be closer with them than you would a people that you just spent a week with, So just that idea. So he remains here in Corinth for 18 months after that encouragement from the Lord. We also see several prominent Jews are converted. Even the leader of the synagogue and his entire household converts over to Christianity. We also see he's preaching full time now. Silas and Timothy have joined him here, which are probably helping out with that type of thing. But that's what we see. And the next part of this is really just some more events here. Verse 12 says, but while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuaded men to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there was a question about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Well, if you stop and you think about it, the Romans really didn't care who the Jews worshipped as long as they paid their taxes. I mean, really, that's what it came down to. And actually, if you know anything about the Roman government and how they did things, the government would come in, they would conquer people, and then what they would do is they'd let them hold on to some of their customs. They'd let them hold on to the gods that they wanted. Because if you oppress a group and you take from them their land, but then you try to make them feel comfortable and say, go ahead, you can still worship your God, there's going to be less of a chance of them rising up against you because you're letting them live their life still. And let's face it, with the Romans may have came the idea of worldly lifestyle and sin, but with the Romans also came some comforts and some things that made life easier. You ever go over into Europe and Asia and see some of the aqueducts that the Romans built to deliver water to some of these big cities? I mean, they did some really good things for folks. But, one of the things you see here, you remember that dream that Paul had, and God said, don't worry about it. I have people that are here for you. Now, I look at that as, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is talking about individuals that are followers of his. Because if you look at God's track record, how many times has he used people from the world to benefit his people? Obviously God has some control in those things. And, you look at individuals, kings and such that helped out the Israelites throughout the times just because of what God has done for them. So obviously, after a period of time of them teaching, it seems good. There's always going to be some more opposition that comes their way. Now, in 18 through 22, we see that Luke writes that Paul continues to minister once acquitted at trial. So in other words, he walks out, he goes back and does what he was doing before. But after a year and a half, felt that it was time to return home. He brings Aquila and Priscilla with him and leaves them in Ephesus, where he spends a little bit of time but promises to return. And really what he does is he kind of ends this journey, kind of stopping in Ephesus and more, and likely dropping off Priscilla and Aquila, probably to strengthen the foundation of the church. Because if you stop and you think about it, what you're going to look here, actually, Priscilla is going to be a facilitator of the word here shortly, teaching somebody that knew John's gospel and actually had a pretty good understanding of Jesus, but hadn't brought it all together. And this individual gets out and he teaches in the synagogue, and we'll get another learning moment from that third journey too, where we learn that, hey, if somebody says something wrong, like say we're talking about in a congregational setting, and someone says something wrong, is it always the best time to correct them right there in front of everybody? No. And I can tell you there were times in my life when I was a lot younger, when, I was trying to learn to preach and teach and things like that, and I was learning more about the Bible, and there were a couple of times that I would say things that kind of didn't come out the right way, or they didn't, because anytime, the times that people came and talked to me, I listened and I said, well, yeah, I agree with what you said. It just, the way I said it must not have came out the right way. But my main point is I can remember that. There was about three or four people that I can picture that I remember this happened. They pulled me aside afterwards and they said, I wanted to talk to you about something you said. And you know what? I want that. If somebody wants to talk about what we just said, let's talk. Even if you're going to come to me and say, I disagree. Because how can we have a discussion if we can't sit down and talk? And so that's just another thing. I know I'm jumping ahead there a little bit, but that's something we'll spend some time on next week, the idea of just how we deal with individuals when they're wrong. Obviously, to attack is not the right move, but that's what he's kind of heading back home at this point. And they stop in Ephesus for a little bit. Aquila and Priscilla end up staying, and then he continues on. And then that's when we'll get into the next journey next week. Yes, sir.
There's something there too that kind of ties in some verses you see in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It talks about Paul being a tent maker.
Yeah.
And he joined up with Priscilla and Aquila. But in 1st Corinthians, he actually makes reference to the fact that he didn't put a burden on them.
Yeah.
He was working himself.
Right.
Not, he didn't want to put a burden on them.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that ties in. We could say, even if you were reading 1 Corinthians alone, you would go, well, what was he doing? Well, we know it.
Yeah. He was a tent maker. Yeah. And that's an important thing because, what about that? I mean, if somebody's in that position where they're a missionary, so to speak, and they're not in their own home. Now, I know there's lots of people that would invite you into your home, they would feed you, they would do it, and they wouldn't expect you to do anything. But you got to look at the circumstances here, too. most of the time, at least in my past, of what I've known of people, if someone wants to do a missionary type journey, they usually try to come up with funds before they go. So then there you go. You're getting there. Someone may be supplying a home or a bed for you to sleep in, or maybe even cooking meals for you, but you've provided a financial, so you're not, a yoke on them, so to speak. But that's what Paul said. He was there preaching, but he was also working. It wasn't, hey, we both do the same thing. I'm just going to crash on your couch for a little bit. No, he was working, and that's what a Christian is expected to do. Paul finishes his second missionary journey by greeting the church at Caesarea, where the port of entry was located, and then he makes his way north to Antioch to report on his mission and to really probably take a break and rest from his travels. Then you will see, as we finish up this second journey here, one of the things that you'll see is when we come into the third journey, you're starting to kind of see some things. Maybe it's just because you already know ahead of time that Paul's eventually going to get arrested. But by the time we get to the end of the journey, he's heading back to Jerusalem, and people are sending him messages and saying, don't come here. But obviously, Paul's on a mission. Paul knows where he needs to go, and I think the only person that would have stopped Paul from going to Jerusalem is if he would have had another one of those dreams where God visited him and said, hey, I don't want you to go there right now. But you know what? It was obvious that Paul being arrested was meant for a reason for the Gentiles, was it not? Because now that is going to take Paul to Rome. And as much as all the way up to even the emperor is going to hear from him and know the word of God being preached. To me, it's really amazing because, this second missionary journey kind of started out with, we're just going to kind of go visit all the people we went and saw the first time, and then all of a sudden, boom, the invitation is opened up, that Macedonian call, and Paul just grabs a hold of that and runs with it. All right. Anyone have any questions or comments or anything else they would like to add? Okay. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the missionary journey here for the third one. So I would encourage you, go ahead and read the next couple chapters if you want to kind of see where we're going. Actually, 19, 20, and 21, I believe, is also, because there's 23. Maybe it's just 20. It might be 20. I didn't have it written in my notes exactly which chapters it was. But go ahead, and if you want to read ahead, you can take a look at that. It won't be next Sunday, though, because I won't be here. Tom Derby's supposed to be filling in for me on Sundays, on the Sunday that I'm gone, so I will be at the camp, but we'll pick this up the following Sunday, and we'll go from there. We'll get this finished up so that we can get moving into our list of questions and comments. But if that's all that we have at this moment, let's offer the invitation to those that have come to that realization that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. If you want to be baptized, we can do that for you. Or maybe you need some prayers of encouragement, just need to share your issues with the church so that we can pray for you. If there's anyone here that has a need, come forward as we stand and sing.